Hi guys, Joe Garth here from Quixel. As an environment artist, my job revolves around the creation of realistic 3D scenes for real-time computer graphics. I've mostly worked on video games, cinematics, and technology demonstrations. I'm originally from Sheffield, in the UK. I moved away when I was 18 to start an internship at Crytek in Frankfurt, Germany. While I was at Crytek, I worked as a cinematic artist on several games such as Crysis 2, Crysis 3, and Warface. I'm a self-taught artist, which means I don't have any official academic education. Everything I've learned has been through my own experience of building games and cinematics, from my talented mentors and colleagues, and from, of course, online tutorials, just like this one. In recent years, I've shifted my focus from cinematics to environment art. I think it's really important to spread information freely and create concentrations of value that normal people have access to. That's one of the reasons I love Quixel Megascans. Quixel Megascans is an online asset library with currently 10,000 unique photorealistic scans, with more and more added every day. This massive database contains almost every material you could imagine, as well as fully fledged 3D assets and vegetation that come ready to be used in offline renderers and real-time game engines like Unreal Engine 4 and Unity. Once you have this quantity of photorealistic assets at your fingertips, it becomes easier than ever before to build 3D scenes. For GDC 2019, we wanted to demonstrate this with our new cinematic short film, Rebirth. The goal was to show that not only is photorealism now fully achievable in real time, but that when leveraging Megascans, it can also be done really quickly and with very few people. We wanted to prove a simple and fun workflow that works for everyone, for games, VFX, ArchViz, automotive, and beyond. And most importantly, we wanted to show everyone exactly how all of this was done. In this tutorial series, I'm going to dive into our thought process when constructing scenes like these, and showcase some of the powerful Unreal Engine 4 features that allowed us to achieve this level of quality. I'll be showing you how to create realistic compositions, explaining dynamic lighting, atmospherics and particles, post-processing effects like grain, chromatic aberration and vignetting, and even in-engine color grading. I'll also be showing how we set up our meshes and textures to achieve such high quality in our close-up shots while maintaining good frame rates. I'll also explain the camera work used in the demo and how we use virtual cameras to create realistic movements. Finally, I'm going to go over how to output final 4K resolution frame outputs for standard dynamic range and high dynamic range. So, grab yourselves a cup of tea and let's get started. Bringing Megascans into Unreal Engine 4 is a fully automated process with Quixel Bridge. Quixel Bridge is a powerful content management tool that ships with Megascans. With a single click, it imports any number of scans you need directly into the engine, and sets up optimized shaders and LOD chains automatically. Here you can see me browsing through assets in Quixel Bridge, and then hitting export to get them into Unreal Engine. Master materials are configured and material instances are automatically set up. That means you're free to use any Unreal Engine master material that you like, and you can immediately start applying some of the custom parameters that you have in your material. For instance, here I'm tweaking the tint of the albedo. I can also change the pixel depth offset parameter here to blend my assets into the terrain a little better. Those functions are all part of our custom master material. For this demo, we weren't as concerned about achieving 60 frames per second in 4K, as you might be if you're creating, for instance, an interactive experience. Instead, we were targeting a cinematic frame rate of 24 frames per second. With this in mind, we wanted to step things up and see how far we could push the photorealistic quality in real time, by making the absolute most of high-resolution Megascans, much like you would in a typical VFX production. This meant taking advantage of the original high-poly source scan data which ships with all Megascans 3D assets, and reducing the triangle count. We reduced the triangle count just enough so that it would run at 24 frames per second in 4K on a single 1080 Ti. Here's a comparison of a high-poly Megascans mesh, and the typical level of detail 0 game geometry. As you can see, the high poly on the right side makes a huge difference. To achieve these hybrid next-generation poly counts, we combined the Megascans library with Houdini in order to batch process all of our assets. We wanted to have a very specific configuration for all the assets in the demo. First, we took the high poly meshes from Megascans and reduced them to around 25%. We thought this was a good trade-off of price and performance that the 1080 Ti can handle as a LOD0 mesh. Here you can see me rotating around the Megascans mesh. As I move away from it, the detail level decreases. And as I get closer, it increases again. This is because of level of detail meshes, or LODs. In this demo, we made sure that the closest mesh, the LOD0, was as close as possible to a high poly mesh from Megascans. The rest of the LODs are the usual LOD0 to 5 game-ready meshes as you would find them on Megascans. The high poly mesh in LOD0 makes a huge difference to visual fidelity when the camera or player gets really close. The great thing is, as soon as the camera moves away from these, the extra polys are LODed away. Unreal's level of detail meshes are based on screen percentage, so assets can be made to only switch to LOD0 when viewed very closely, when they take up a lot of space on the screen. We imported 8K textures, but found that there wasn't really a drastic difference between 8K and 4K when viewing individual assets overall. It's more of a challenge of adjusting asset scale so that the overall texel density of the scene is consistent. That means you have to make sure that objects are a consistent scale in regards to the amount of texture resolution that they hold. If you scale an object too high, the texture quality is going to drop for that object, so you have to keep an eye on it. With assets set up in this way, we managed to find a nice trade-off between real-time usability and next-generation quality for extreme close-ups. For Rebirth, we didn't just want to achieve photorealism. We also wanted to create beautiful, artistically composed shots that wouldn't look out of place in a professional photographer's portfolio. I was lucky enough to work with a talented art director, Victor Bonafonte, who created a concept art and mood board for our entire cinematic. Once these sorts of images and ideas are down on paper, it's then the challenge of bringing them to life in 3D. It helps so much to go into the process of building 3D scenes when you have a good vision and plan. In addition to two-dimensional composition, it was also important for us to achieve good three-dimensional composition. By that, I mean the actual placement of 3D assets in the context of the overall environment. A good scene composition can help to promote a sense of scale and add a natural sense of organization and rules. And nature has a lot of rules for us to follow. The real world has a lot going on. Every little detail has a story behind it. Every rock, mud trail, and giant boulder came from somewhere. Millions of years of erosion, rain, wind, flooding, lava, volcanoes, earthquakes. A place like Iceland has all kinds of geological activity. When you see a rock on the floor, surrounded by a gradient of large to small pebbles that dissipates into a muddy trail, that's happening because nature has rules. Half the battle when producing realistic 3D scenes is taking into account at least some of these factors, and the best way to make sure that you're working realistically is to study reference. On this project, we were lucky enough to visit Iceland and take a ton of photographs alongside the 3D scans. These references are all included out of the box with the Icelandic Megascans collection. This meant that we had a perfect bank of reference photography when building out these scenes. We even had photographs with the actual 3D assets in the real world. These were invaluable for understanding how certain assets fit into their surroundings. Of course, there's nothing stopping you from using Google Images or Street View, or from visiting your own local national park or wildlife preserve and taking similar reference photography. Even if you're just taking pictures with a mobile phone, it's much better than no reference at all. So now, I'm going to walk you guys through the process of assembling this scene. The 2D composition of this overall image is relatively simple. The rocks are systematically placed in the first and second third of the screen, and the amount of sky, mountains, and ground is also split evenly into thirds. This is a pretty common technique known as the rule of thirds. It helps to bring balance and structure to an image. So in Unreal Engine 4, I'm going to hit New Level and create an empty level. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new landscape. Now I'm just going to set the overall resolution to 2017 by 2017 and hit create. That's going to give us a little bit more resolution. It doesn't need to be too high because most of our detail is going to come from the Megascan's geometry and our distance meshes. For the landscape material, I'm going to be using my own custom landscape auto material. This material is really flexible because it allows me to sculpt the terrain and automatically have the textures update. The slopes are automatically given a rocky cliff texture. Another great trick is to use alpha brushes to sculpt the terrain. Just go to the sculpt tool and instead of circle, choose alpha brush. You can then choose from various different height maps and plug those into the texture slot. You can have 4 different brushes stored in the alpha in the various texture channels and you can switch between them. Then simply change the brush size to the scale that you want to stamp down. This is a really fast way to get lots of terrain detail very quickly. Different brushes can get lots of cool different erosion results, and the great thing about this technique is you don't need to bake anything. This is perfect when you're just prototyping a scene and trying to block something out really quickly. When the camera gets close to the terrain, a Megascan's texture provides a lot of the detail. This terrain provides a sort of smooth canvas on which we're going to place more detailed geometry on top. Here I'm dragging some Megascan's geometry out from the content browser and seeing how it looks with the terrain. In this case, I made sure that the terrain texture would match really well with the Megascan's geometry. This can usually be achieved by picking relatively similar texture styles, as well as using the tint function in the shader, and also the pixel depth offset parameter for object terrain blending. While I'm blocking out scenes, I like to put in some temporary lighting and fog, just to make sure that I have an idea of how the overall scene is going to look in the end. Of course, this lighting can be super basic and very ambient. I'm actually going to leave the directional light intensity to 0, so I've got a completely ambient scene. So now I'm just going to start blocking out the scene. For this, I'm just going to start dragging in all the geometry that I think I'm going to need. These 3 assemblies I found really useful, because they help me pepper large amounts of the terrain with detail. Whenever I find useful assets like these, I like to group them together so I can use them over and over. So the objective here is just to create a really convincing and detailed ground plane, on which we're going to put all of our bigger assemblies later. Here's one of the larger lava rocks that I'm going to use for the right side of the image. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm just going to place it right here on the right side. And this is the second one I'm going to use. Even in the early blocking stages, it helps to look at reference, just to make sure that everything makes sense scale-wise. Try to identify certain features of the reference. For instance here, you can see there's a sort of mound forming around the rock. The mound is made up of lots of larger rocks that then sort of fall off into smaller pebbles, and then eventually mud. The more time you can spend on little set dressing details like this, the more natural the work is going to look. Another really important thing to do is check the scale of your scene. For that, I usually drag a mannequin into the scene so it's right in the center. At this point, I'm going to start thinking about the 2-dimensional composition as well. I'm going to start looking at the scene through a camera, and make sure that everything lines up with the concept. For this project we used a 21:9 aspect ratio. It's really important to pick an aspect ratio before you start your shot creation process. I'll talk more about aspect ratios and render outputs in the final part. So, last but not least, I'm going to add some of the background mountains. This part's extremely important to make sure that we achieve a sense of scale. For Rebirth, we created these huge background mountain pieces, using a combination of Houdini and LiDAR data. Each of these hero pieces has tons of little details. All of the moss, erosion, and rivers are all baked into the textures. This is perfect because you can pretty much just place background mountains as you would Megascan's assemblies. A really common mistake when placing mountains is to make them too steep or too jagged. Again, looking at reference is the key. From the reference shots of this region, we can see that the mountains are actually relatively small. Don't be afraid to pull the mountains really far into the distance and then scale them up really big. Remember, in real life, these mountains can be sometimes kilometers across. Of course, these sort of meshes are only used for the very far distant mountains. For anything really close to the camera, we used a combination of Unreal Engine landscape with an auto material, and lots of Megascan's geometry put on top, such as cliffs. So after some work, here's the final block out that I came up with. Once you've reached this point, things become a lot simpler, because you're then focusing on just refining the scene. This whole process only took about a day. Of course, there's still a ton of work left to do if we really want to hit photorealistic quality. So as you can see, I'm a lot further along with my set dressing process now. I've had the time to add lots of small details and really use the reference as a guide. Here you can see some of those big rocks fading into pebbles that I was talking about earlier. And you can easily just blend these into the rest of the terrain using other assemblies. Another thing I've had time for is to add lots of little details like grass and pebbles. This sort of long grass is created using atlases from Megascans, and the geometry itself is modelled by hand. We had a huge helping hand from the guys at Side Effects. They helped us get all of the foliage set up with Pivot Painter. That means all of our grass sways in the wind quite realistically. Now I'm going to work on the lighting in this scene. The first thing I'm going to do is disable all of the lighting related entities. That's the directional light, the exponential height fog, the post-processing volume, the sky dome, and the skylight. We want to make sure that we don't have any of that enabled to begin with. The first step is going to be setting up a background. You'll want a sky dome and the exponential height fog set up first. The first component is the sky dome. This is basically just a massive sphere with 10,000 scale. It has a two-sided material, so we can always see it. In this super overcast example, it's basically just completely grey. But usually you would have some sort of skybox or sky dome texture that's projecting around the scene. I'll show you that later. So the next step is to add the exponential height fog. Here's one that I've already configured to some pretty reasonable settings. You can see that I've already adjusted the height fall off and the max opacity to try to get some really nice results. It's sort of just getting that fade off between the horizon line and the very tops of the mountains that really gives the mountains some distance. Once you think you have a convincing backdrop, the next step is to go to your skylight. The skylight is really important. The skylight is an entity that lets you capture the entire environment around it. It then uses that capture to generate an ambient light for the entire scene. This can give some really realistic results. So how do we generate this thing correctly? Well, the first step is to return all of the values to make sure they're back to their defaults. Then I'm going to bring out my sky dome material. In my sky dome material, I've got something called the sky multiplier. This is basically just a simple multiplier that controls the brightness of the sky. You can see that as I make my sky dome brighter and then hit recapture, the entire ambient light of the scene then increases. So the idea here is to try to adjust your background so that you get the skylight intensity that you want. There are also some ways to cheat this in the skylight properties, but it's best to try and be as physically accurate as possible. The fog is also another huge factor to the skylight capture, because of course it can have a big influence on the overall brightness and colours of the scene. If you do produce an aesthetically pleasing but dark background that then doesn't generate much ambient light, you can of course boost the intensity of the skylight, but this can sometimes give too even results like these. A better option is sometimes to just decouple the skylight from the captured scene and switch the source type to SLS specified cube map. This means you can simply drag and drop an HDR texture into the scene and use that instead. You're then free to tweak the skylight and the background completely separately from each other. This can be great if you're trying to get a really specific look, such as something that you've seen in a reference photo. Careful though, because it won't be as physically accurate, and when you do introduce a directional light to the scene, remember that won't be taken into account as the ambient light around isn't being captured from the scene itself. Now we have our ambient light set up though, we can start to play a bit with the directional light. But in this scene, I really just kept it super minimal. There's very little light direction. It's actually set to only 0.3 in the final short film. For the purposes of this lighting tutorial though, I thought it might be useful to show you how I would create a completely different lighting setup for this scene. So what I'm going to try and do is create a sunset mood and use a different HDR. So here you can see I'm just rotating the directional light around and trying to find a pretty cool light direction with some long shadows. From there I can go to the light color and change it to more of an orangish tone. I think this is pretty cool, but the big thing that's missing now is the backdrop, and that's going to really affect how the ambient light works in the scene as well. So I'm going to go back into my sky dome material, and instead of the overcast HDR, I'm going to switch it for a more sunset HDR texture. Okay, so the sky dome's looking pretty nice. There are a few things I'm going to have to fix though. The first thing I'm going to do is go into my skylight and change the generation from the specified cube map to a captured scene, and then hit recapture. You can see that the colours and tones of the ambient light already look more natural, as they're taking the real capture from the sky. The next step is to align the sky dome with the directional light, so that the sun is in roughly the same position. You can do that by simply changing the Z rotation on the sky dome itself, or in certain sky dome or sky materials there should be an option for it. Once you're happy with the alignment, you can then select both the sky dome and directional light together, and then orbit them around. This is a really cool way to adjust the lighting and maintain the consistency of both the directional light and the sky dome together. So I'm pretty happy with these results. The next step would be to work more on the atmospherics and stuff like post-production, color grading, to try to get more vibrancy and realism out of the image. For our demo, we had a huge focus on atmospheric fog. To achieve these effects, we used quite a few different techniques. The most common was to use the built-in atmospheric and exponential height fog. You can see me turning that on and off here, but you might notice that not very much is happening. While atmospheric and exponential height fog can give really good results for general atmosphere, they're unfortunately lacking for these sort of subtle, wispy effects that really are iconic in Iceland. It's also impossible to create certain long gradients, for instance where the tops of mountains are covered by fog. We had a lot of shots that required these effects, so we had to come up with alternative methods. Luckily, Unreal Engine has an extremely advanced material graph, which allows you to build custom programmable shaders. To create the top fog effect, I used a texture card with a custom shader. The shader is actually really simple. It's just a usual material with a translucent blend mode, and an opacity map input alongside a few other parameters. The real secret ingredient here is the use of the depth fade node. I use this to give the material a new parameter called fade distance. This means you can clip the fog plane into the terrain or any other object. When you tweak the fade distance, it blurs the edge of the intersection, so you don't see it at all. This is perfect for top fog or any other wispy fog cards that you want to place in your scene. We also used Houdini to generate some custom animated fog planes as well. That gave the planes some more realistic looking movement. This technique also worked really well for large background gradients, like in this shot. This is all done using just one fog card. I can tweak the fade distance, the fog intensity, and the individual albedo parameters as well, like tint. It's really cool to be able to play around with different colors and atmospherics like this in real time. It doesn't take long to try out lots of different looks and find one that's realistic. A shot like this one really demonstrates the power of the animated fog cards. If I remove some of the more intense fog planes, you can see that most of the subtle movements are being generated by these animated fog textures. And because this is a card, I have full control about where it's placed in the scene and how it clips in with geometry. Of course, many AAA games use animated particles like this, or animated textures as background planes. Sometimes you shouldn't be afraid to fake things, especially if you can come up with a very cheap solution to a really difficult problem. Of course, there are some effects that aren't that easy to fake. We really wanted to get volumetric fog on the headlights of the vehicle. Unreal Engine's volume fog proved very easy to use and actually quite stable. There are a few tweaks that you need to make using console variables to get the best out of it, however. The first tweak is to turn temporal reprojection to 0. This was because we had the fog attached to the vehicle, which meant that as the vehicle was moving, the lights weren't able to keep up in the fog. This is to do with how Unreal Engine calculates the volume fog. The other thing that can help is to change the grid pixel size console variable. This can sometimes give you more quality. Just be sure not to set it to a value below 3, because it can get very performance intensive for your machine. Another great way to add atmosphere is to use particles. The great thing is that particles can give the appearance of some real volume, while not being that performance intensive. In this scene, I peppered the sides of the canyon with some particles to give it some more depth. It also gave the vehicle a better sense of speed as they go rushing past the camera. Post-processing is a really important step when you're done composing your scene and you've finalized the lighting. It's something that can really push your image quality to the next level of realism. However, it's possible to overdo it and make your scene look really artificial. I'm going to go through and tell you what to avoid and what can really make a big difference. For our short, we really tried to keep the post-processing minimal and subtle. At the moment, the post-processing volume in this scene is disabled, so I'm just going to scroll down and hit Enable. As you can see, the post-processing settings make a huge difference. It goes from a much brighter and very evenly lit scene to something slightly darker with more bluish tones. That change is a combination of color grading and post-processing together. One of the most important post-processing effects is depth of field. When used correctly, it can give focus to an area of the shot and really help the composition. It's also one of those features that helps to make an image feel like it was shot on a real camera. This is one of those post effects that's really good to have a plan for from the beginning. The first thing that you want to do is make sure that you're using the correct depth of field method. There are 3 different depth of field methods. We chose Circle DOF because it's the latest and provides a really cinematic and filmic look. This depth of field is also really easy to use. To use depth of field, simply add your camera to the sequencer and choose Focus Settings, and then choose Manual Focus Distance. This will give you a new track in the sequencer. As you animate this value, it lets you change where the camera is focused. So as I lower it, you can see the entire scene is getting very blurry. And as I raise it again, it becomes sharp. The focus distance is just one component of the system, however. The other property that you can control is the range of the depth of field. This is done by manipulating the f-stop. A smaller f-stop value will give you a smaller range and fall off to the depth of field. So play around with the f-stop number and the manual focus distance and see what works well for your shot. Another post-processing effect is chromatic aberration. This is a very subtle effect that appears on the edges of objects. This effect should definitely be used with caution, as it can give very unrealistic results if the values are set too high. In real-life photography, this is a super subtle effect that barely distorts the edges of objects in the image. For most of our scenes, we kept this value to 0.05, so very subtle. The next effect on the list is bloom. We usually set bloom to 0 for our project. Bloom is one of those post-processing effects that fits very well for certain art styles. For instance, if you're creating something that's more cartoonish or fantasy, it can work really well to give every image a bright, hazy atmosphere that looks kind of surreal. We wanted our images to look as photorealistic as possible, so we completely disabled it. We also didn't use the dirt mask feature because we wanted to keep our images relatively clean. For the camera settings, I recommend that you keep those at the defaults. Unless you're trying to achieve something very specific with motion blur or depth of field, then I think it's better off that you leave these alone. The next really important setting is exposure. With exposure, you have the option to switch between different metering modes and different minimum and maximum brightnesses. For Rebirth, we didn't use the automatic exposure. We simply set the value of the minimum and the maximum to the same thing. That meant that each time we rendered, we got the same result. A common pitfall is to make the scene too bright or too dark in the exposure settings, and then trying to compensate for that with the rest of the lighting, like the sun direction or the skylight. If you're really lost and not really sure what the default values should be, try setting the minimum brightness and maximum brightness to 1. There's another value that you can tweak in the camera settings called exposure compensation, but I recommend that you leave that at 0. The scene should show its real brightness now. If it's too dark or too light there, it could be that your lighting needs adjusting. It's best to make sure that you use these neutral exposure settings when you're doing your lighting, otherwise you might have to go back later and tweak the scene brightness. The next post-processing effect is vignetting. The built-in vignetting in Unreal Engine 4 is limited to just one value, but I actually found the results to be very good. Vignetting effectively darkens the edges of the screen, bringing the focus into the middle of the shot. For most of our shots, we left the vignetting value to 0.4, which is the default. Another post-processing effect is film grain. Unreal Engine 4 has a built-in film grain, however, we found that to be a bit limiting. When you increase the film grain intensity, you can see that it affects all parts of the image, including the bright areas. In reality, real-world film grain usually only affects the darkest parts of the image. It's not just a simple filter overlaid on everything. To get around this issue, I built a custom post-process material that allows you to control how much grain the overall image has and which areas of the image, dark or light, it affects. As I increase the brightness here, you can see that my own grain starts to affect the entire image. And then as I reduce it, you can see it's only showing up in the darkest parts. If I tweak the shader a little, I can expose the debug view. This is the buffer that I multiply the grain on. It has some simple brightness and contrast controls. The material itself is relatively simple. The grain itself is controlled by a panner, which is just constantly scrolling across. That's then connected to a grain texture, which is in turn added to the UVs of another grain texture. This means our grain texture gets a constant sort of random scrolling effect. The grain texture itself is taken from an ARRI film camera. So if we zoom in here, you can see how we've actually got some nice sampled film grain. Moving along, we have a few settings for color correction and some parameters to increase and offset the power. Once we have the grain effect, we can now combine it with the post-processing output of the entire scene. To produce the grain mask, I take the output and desaturate it completely, and then use a multiply for the contrast and an add node for the brightness. The grain and the image output are then multiplied together and blended. This then produces the final emissive color pass. The last post-processing effect I want to talk about is motion blur. As you can see here from this still frame, motion blur is present in most of our shots. You can access the settings for motion blur from the post-processing volume. From there, you can tweak the amount and also the maximum amount. For certain shots we wanted more motion blur, so we cranked the maximum amount a little bit higher. The trick here is just to use your own judgment of when a lot of motion blur is necessary. Unreal Engine pretty much takes care of the rest. Color grading is a really important process that happens right at the end of production. With color grading, we can take a neutral image and give it a cinematic or filmic quality. We can make certain colors pop out and make the image seem more warm or more cold, depending on the direction that we're going in. One of the best ways to achieve good color grading is to make sure that you have a natural looking basis to work from. That means a shot that's relatively neutrally lit, and that the dark areas aren't too black. If areas become too dark, then there's no information for the grading to work with. Same goes for highlights or white areas. So what are we trying to achieve with color grading? How you grade your shot depends on your goal. Some films are graded in a certain way to aid the story, or to use color to allow actors and objects to pop on the screen. With our short film, we wanted to use grading to give a slightly cold Icelandic look. This involved introducing a subtle amount of blue into the shadows, and in some cases, the entire image. We also tweak the contrast so that everything pops out more. Unreal Engine has a built-in, comprehensive color grading system that allowed us to do all the grading in-engine. You can see here on the right, I have all of the different color wheels. These allow you to tweak everything from white balance, saturation, contrast, gamma, and gain. You can tweak the shadows, midtones, and highlights individually, as well as global controls for the entire image. So here in Photoshop, I've made a quick mock-up of the kind of color grading that I'd like to achieve. I'm going to try and reproduce this color grade using the in-engine color grading controls. The first thing I'm going to do is boost the contrast a little bit, so I'm just adjusting it here to 1.2. That should help me match the contrast to the Photoshop mock-up and give a nice little pop to the whole image. The next thing I'm going to do is try and get a little bit more blue in the shadows. To do that, I'm going to use the gain function, so just go under shadows and try to find gain, and then tick the box, then you can simply tweak the color wheel. Of course, everything updates in real time, so there's no waiting around to see any kind of results. At the very bottom of the shadows section, there's an option called Shadows Max. This basically lets you tweak the cutoff point where the shadows and the midtones start. You can use that to tweak how much of the image is affected by shadow. I'm always jumping back to my original Photoshop mockup to see if I'm getting closer. I think the next thing I need to do is tweak the highlights. You might notice that out of the box, when you tweak the gain on the highlights, nothing's happening. That's because you need to tweak the highlights minimum amount, which will change how much of the image gets affected by highlights. So I'm just going to tweak the highlights a little bit more bluish. The other thing I did in Photoshop was really make the highlights contrast a little bit more so that everything pops. A little bit of this is good, but be careful not to push it too far because it can make everything look quite metallic, especially when you're dealing with blue tones. So now I think I've got a little bit closer, I'm just going to take a screenshot from the engine and compare it to the Photoshop version that I started with. So going back and forth, I can see that I got pretty close to my initial idea. Of course, once you get super confident with the engine tools, you don't need to use Photoshop at all. You can simply eyeball it in the engine and work completely in real time. I absolutely love this workflow, because it meant that coordinating various colours on different shots across the whole project was really easy. One final feature to discuss is ambient occlusion. I put this in the colour grading section, because I think that this can be very dangerous if you start tweaking it too early on. If I go up to the Lit menu here and choose Buffer Visualization, I can view the ambient occlusion buffer. So the idea is that here you should only be seeing darkness on the edges of objects where they connect. Ambient occlusion is something that really needs to be added right at the end of the process. And it should be just a very supplemental effect that just adds a little bit of darkness that helps merge objects together where they connect. The idea with this post effect is that it shouldn't change the overall brightness of the image. It should be more of a sort of subtle darkening effect that goes on at the very end. So you can go in and tweak the power value, but as you can see, it can sometimes make the image look way too dark, and that affects the grade. When used correctly, the effect can be really nice though, and merge the whole scene together, and make it feel pretty seamless. If I go up to the show menu here, I can completely disable all of the color grading. It's pretty amazing what a drastic difference the tone mapping combined with color grading really makes, as well as ambient occlusion. The trick is to really concentrate on getting that kind of boring, neutral, but natural looking scene as a good starting point, and then you're in a good position to add cinematic effects on top. Another huge part of production involved the use of virtual cameras. A virtual camera lets us record real, physical camera movement. This virtual camera rig has a motion tracker, which allows us to record the exact position of the camera in 3D space. There's a live link to the Unreal Engine, so we can see everything happening in real time. Live Link is a plugin you can enable in Unreal Engine 4. The camera operator also wears a VR headset in order to view the scene as he's recording. Once everything was recorded, we got keys that filled every frame in the sequencer. From there, we can clean up the keys a little bit and correct the animation in places. Unreal Engine's curve editor was perfect for making these small edits. In the end, we used real camera data on almost every shot, even on shots that you wouldn't expect would really need it. Some of these static shots have it, even though it's just super subtle. It adds just a little bit of extra realism that can fool the human eye. So if you have the time and budget, it's definitely one of those things that's worth doing. Some of the trickiest shots to record were the ones where the camera is mounted to the vehicle. For shots like these, we had to get creative. Here you can see everyone shaking the chair of the camera operator to give it some nice little jitters. This actually did a really good job of making it look like the vehicle was actually shaking. It's really cool being able to interact with the virtual world in real time in this way, and it means you can play with real world physics to get really nice results. In this section, I'm going to be talking about how to achieve a good final frame output. These final frames will be the ones that you can use with your video editing application like Premiere or Final Cut. To render out frames, simply hit the little clapperboard icon. This will bring up a new dialog. In this dialog, we can define our various render settings. You have 3 different options for output format: PNG, JPEG, and BMP. There's also a more sophisticated format called EXR, which I'll talk about later. The next step is to choose your frame rate. For our short film, we went with a cinematic 24 FPS. This is pretty much a standard in the movie industry. The next thing to consider is your output resolution. We have a small trick here that we used, which is that we output in a resolution of 5120 by 2160. So it's still a 21:9 aspect ratio, but it gives us a lot more pixels to work with, and we can downsample from that huge 5K image to a 4K one. This really helps to reduce aliasing or pixelation or any subtle pixel crawling. This is great for smooth results. We also used an additional console variable when rendering, called Tone Mapper Sharpening. Just search for Tone Mapper in the console and you'll find it. This allows you to access Unreal Engine's built-in sharpening effect. This can be a really great way to add some subtle detail to your image. It is possible to push it a bit too far though, so make sure that you use a low enough value. We kept ours to a reasonable 0.5, so there are a few last settings that we need to dial in. As you can see, I've set the compression quality to 100. That should make sure that my output frames don't get too heavily compressed by the JPEG algorithm. The next step is to make sure that your output directory is set up correctly. Simply point it to the folder of your choosing and the frames will appear there. Most of the other settings you can simply leave at their defaults. However, we did add 100 frames to the warm-up frame count, and also 3 seconds delay before warm-up, and before the shot warm-up. Once you're done configuring settings, simply hit Capture Movie to start the capture process. Unreal quite helpfully will probably prompt you to save your level, and I encourage you to do so. And on that note, it's probably a good time to remind everyone, make sure you back up your work and save everything. There's absolutely nothing more frustrating than losing days worth of work just out of complacency. So as you can see, Unreal Engine started capturing video. You might notice that it's zoomed in on a certain part of the image. That's just because we're capturing in 5K. Now that's finished, you should be able to go to your folder and see the final outputted JPEG frames. I sometimes just open up the frames in OpenView for a quick inspection. There's also a really cool program that you can use called DJV Viewer. You can just drag and drop frames into DJV and it'll let you preview your rendered sequences. It takes a bit of time to cache the images, especially with 5K. But it's worth it because it can then play back those images completely smoothly. You can really zoom into different parts of the image, and then you can pan around using the middle mouse button. You can also go into the full screen mode by hitting U. This is just perfect for inspection. It really meant that I could spend some time looking at my final image output and making sure there weren't that many kinks in the armor of my set dressing. DJV can also preview EXR files. EXR gives you the ability to render HDR images. So if you render something like PNG or JPEG, you're only going to be getting an 8-bit image, whereas an EXR has a full 32-bit color range. Of course, for you to actually see this effect, you'll need to have an HDR compatible monitor. Luckily for us, rendering HDRs from Unreal Engine 4 was really simple. Simply go to the render settings dialog, and instead of image sequence, choose custom render passes. A new submenu will appear called Composite Graph Options. From there, you'll be able to choose between certain render passes that will be included. You've got a lot of options here, from base color, metallic, opacity, roughness, specular, all the usual rendering passes. And you also have the ability to render the depth buffer as well. These render passes can be really useful, especially when you have to do some more advanced compositing work. For capture gamut, I recommend that you leave that at sRGB, and make sure you tick capture frames in HDR. The HDR compression quality can be 0, so there's no compression there. And once you're done setting it up, simply hit Capture Movie again, and everything will render. Because we had so many shots in the short film, I wanted to come up with a way to render them out very quickly, and without a lot of manual labor. Again, Unreal Engine has a great solution to this. There's a whole system for batch rendering built into the command line. Using the command line arguments, I was able to string together a bunch of bat files, and then fire them off in a list. I have a small settings file that contains a few parameters like the image format and the resolution, as well as the render location and some other parameters. With this setup, I was able to hit the render all bat and hit a key on the keyboard to start rendering the entire project. This made rendering dailies so much more efficient. This meant that we could easily produce daily renders and work just like a typical VFX studio. It also means that the project can be nicely archived away at the end of production, so that additional renders can be created in the future if they're ever needed. Well, that just about wraps it up for this tutorial. I hope you guys found this informative, and if you have any questions at all related to Unreal Engine or Megascans, leave a comment in the description below. I'll try to go through and answer as many as possible. Again, I'd like to thank the guys at Side Effects for making some awesome tools that helped us a lot with this project. And of course, everyone at Quixel for giving me the chance to work on something so cool. On a personal note, this project really opened my eyes to the possibilities of real-time graphics. I believe now, more than ever, that real-time is the future for movies, automotive, architectural visualizations, and even concept art and graphic design. Game engines like Unreal are the next step to making all of our workflows real-time, and asset libraries like Quixel Megascans and the integrated tools are going to make everyone's lives much easier. This is Joe Garth from Quixel, signing off.